The air in the grand hall of the Chicago Art Institute was thick with the scent of money and expensive perfume, a suffocating mixture that clung to the velvet drapes and polished marble. It was the annual Sterling Foundation Gala, an event where the city's elite gathered to write checks for charity and, more importantly, to be seen. At the center of this glittering universe stood Donovan Sterling, a man who radiated a cold, gravitational power. He moved through the crowd with a predator's grace, his presence silencing whispers as he passed. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the room with a bored, dismissive air until they landed on a target. She was a waitress, moving with a quiet efficiency that was meant to make her invisible. But Donovan saw her pause for a fraction of a second before a portrait of a fiery flamenco dancer, a momentary wistful stillness that broke her professional facade. It was this flicker of humanity, this tiny crack in the room's perfect artifice, that drew his cruel attention. He waited until the string quartet finished their piece, then tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The resulting chime was a high, clear command for silence. Friends, colleagues. He began, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that carried effortlessly across the hall. A moment of entertainment, if you will. His gaze locked onto the waitress, who now stood frozen near a service station, tray in hand. A slow, malicious smile spread across his face. "The orchestra," he commanded, his voice suddenly sharp, "will play Por una cabeza." A murmur went through the crowd. It was a notoriously difficult tango, a piece defined by its passionate, gut-wrenching shifts in tempo and emotion. "And you," he said, his voice dropping as he pointed a manicured finger directly at the waitress, "Elara Vance, if you can dance a single, respectable measure of this tango, I will personally fund a full 4-year scholarship for your younger brother at the University of Chicago." A wave of shocked, titillated laughter rolled through the hall. The dare was a masterpiece of casual cruelty. It was public, it was impossible, and the offered prize was so life-changingly large as to make her refusal seem like a personal failure. He had pinned her to a wall with his wealth, turning her into a spectacle for his own amusement. He leaned back, a king in his court, and waited for the humiliation to begin. To the outside world, Donovan Sterling was an apex predator of the urban jungle. His name was etched onto the sides of gleaming skyscrapers, a testament to a real estate empire built with surgical precision and a notorious lack of sentiment. He moved through life with the cool, frictionless ease of a man who had never been told no. But inside, he was a king ruling a desolate, silent kingdom of one. The root of his bitterness, the crack in his perfect, polished world, hung on the far wall of the gala a life-sized portrait of his late wife, Isabella. She was captured mid-tango, her head thrown back in a moment of pure, ecstatic joy, a crimson flower tucked behind her ear. She was all fire and life, a vibrant, passionate soul who had been the one soft, warm place in his otherwise rigid world. 2 years ago, a sudden, aggressive heart condition had stolen her from him, leaving behind an empire that now felt like a gilded cage. He hated these events. He hated the music, the art, the laughter. Each note from the string quartet was a painful echo of the melodies she used to hum. Every flash of a colorful gown was a pale imitation of the way she used to light up a room. His grief had soured into a potent, caustic anger at the world for continuing to spin, at the people in it for daring to be happy, and most of all, at himself for being unable to protect the only thing he truly valued. So he wielded his power like a shield and a weapon. He made caustic remarks to nervous junior partners. He dismissed ambitious proposals with a bored wave of his hand. He found a grim, hollow satisfaction in reminding everyone of the distance between their world and his. His cruelty was a defense mechanism, a way to keep the messy, unpredictable world of human emotion at bay. He was a man drowning in a sea of unspoken pain, and instead of calling for help, he was trying to pull everyone else under with him. He was blinded by a grief so profound he could no longer distinguish it from his own personality. He believed his cynicism was strength, his detachment a sign of control. He failed to see that he had become a ghost, haunting the halls of his own life, pushing away anyone who dared to get close. That's why he had chosen Elara. He had seen her, just for a moment, looking at Isabella's portrait. He saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes, the quiet reverence of a fellow artist, and it had been like a match struck too close to a leaking gas line. In that instant, she was no longer a waitress. She was a representative of the vibrant, beautiful world that had been stolen from him. His challenge, the cruel, impossible dare, was not just about her. It was about Isabella. It was a twisted, desperate act to desecrate his most sacred memory before it could hurt him again. By demanding that a stranger dance Isabella's dance to Isabella's song, he was trying to prove, in the most public way possible, that the magic was gone forever. Elara Vance moved through the opulent chaos of the gala with a practiced, almost invisible grace. To the guests, she was a function, a pair of hands that refilled a champagne flute or cleared a plate. No one noticed the subtle dancer's poise in her posture, the way she navigated the crowded room not by pushing through it, but by flowing with its currents, her feet instinctively finding the path of least resistance. Her world was one of observation, of reading the unspoken language of a room from its periphery. And she saw Donovan Sterling. She didn't see the billionaire titan the others saw. She saw the gaping, ragged wound at the center of his being. She had seen him earlier, standing before the portrait of the vibrant, dark-haired woman, his back to the room. He thought he was unobserved, and for a single, unguarded moment, the mask of cold indifference had slipped. Elara saw his shoulders slump, his hand rise as if to touch the painted image, then fall back to his side, defeated. It was a gesture of such profound, lonely grief that it resonated with the echo of her own losses. Elara knew the landscape of that kind of pain. Her life had been cleaved in two by a single, catastrophic event, a fire that had claimed both her parents and the small second-floor apartment they had called home. One day, she was a rising star in the competitive tango world, her body a vessel for the fiery, intricate stories of the dance. The next, she was the sole guardian of her 16-year-old brother, Leo. Their world reduced to a few salvaged photo albums and the crushing weight of sudden responsibility. The dance studios, the competitions, The scent of rosin and worn leather dance shoes, it all had to be sacrificed. Her dreams were packed away like old costumes, and she took on the grueling, anonymous work of a server. Her life re-choreographed into a relentless rhythm of double shifts and mounting bills. She didn't resent it. Her love for Leo was a fierce, protective flame that fueled her every step. But a part of her soul, the part that only came alive to the sound of a bandoneon, had fallen silent. So when Donovan Sterling issued his cruel public challenge, she understood its source. It wasn't just the casual arrogance of a rich man, it was the desperate lashing out of a man in agony, a man trying to burn down the last remnants of the beautiful world he had lost. He had chosen her because she had dared to look upon his sacred memory, and for that, she had to be punished. The offer of Leo's scholarship wasn't a prize, it was the salt he intended to rub in her inevitable public wound. He was using his power to prove that, in his world, even the most beautiful things could be bought, trivialized, and ultimately destroyed. The collision was not of bodies, but of worlds. When Donovan Sterling pointed his finger, singling Elara out from the anonymous backdrop of the service staff, he wasn't just issuing a dare, he was drawing a line in the sand, a stark demarcation between his world of power and hers of servitude. He had chosen his moment with a predator's timing. The guests were warm with champagne, the atmosphere convivial, the stage perfectly set for a bit of sport at the expense of someone who couldn't fight back. He had chosen his target with deliberate precision. It wasn't just any waitress. It was the one he had seen looking at Isabella's portrait, the one whose quiet reverence had felt like a trespass on his private grief. In his twisted logic, her silent appreciation was an affront, a claim to an emotion he believed was his alone to hoard. And he had chosen his weapon with exquisite cruelty. Por una cabeza. It wasn't just a difficult tango, it was their tango. It was the song he and Isabella had danced to on a rain-slicked patio in Buenos Aires on their honeymoon. The melody that had become the unofficial anthem of their life together. To demand that a stranger, a servant, dance to it was the ultimate act of desecration. He was taking his most cherished memory and throwing it into the mud, daring her to sully it with her presumed incompetence. The offer of the scholarship for her brother, Leo, was the final, perfect twist of the knife. It wasn't an act of charity. It was a cage. He knew, with the instinctive cunning of the wealthy, that a person in her position couldn't simply refuse. The sum was too life-changing. He was forcing her to participate in her own humiliation. If she refused, she was a fool who had thrown away her brother's future out of pride. If she accepted, she would be a clumsy spectacle, a source of amusement for his jaded guests. Either way, he won. The guests, for their part, became willing accomplices. Their laughter, a mix of shock and cruel delight, was the sound of their endorsement. They saw the scene for what it was, a classic display of power, a billionaire reminding the world that he could bend reality to his will, that even people could become playthings if the price was right. They leaned in, their faces alight with the same morbid curiosity one sees at a Roman circus, waiting for the lion to be released. For Elara, the moment was a distillation of every injustice she had faced. It was the condescending glance of a wealthy patron, the polite rejection from a dance company, the weary ache in her bones after a 14-hour shift. It was the world reminding her, in the most public and brutal way possible, of her place. The collision wasn't just between a billionaire and a waitress, it was between a man determined to destroy a beautiful memory and the one woman in the room who understood exactly what that memory was worth. Faced with an impossible choice, Elara did not crumble. She did not blush or stammer. A lifetime of quiet resilience had forged a core of steel within her. For a long, charged moment, she held Donovan Sterling's gaze, her expression not one of fear, but of profound, sorrowful understanding. Then, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She turned and walked to a nearby service station, where a senior waiter watched her with a mixture of pity and alarm. She untied the strings of her crisp black apron, folded it with the deliberate, respectful motions of a soldier folding a flag, and handed it to him. "Could you hold this for me, please?" she asked, her voice a low, steady murmur that cut through the surrounding whispers. With that simple, symbolic act, she shed the identity they had imposed upon her. She was no longer a waitress. She was Elara Vance. She walked to the center of the polished dance floor, her borrowed, sensible work shoes making a soft, defiant sound on the marble. She didn't look at the crowd, at their phones held aloft like torches. She didn't look at the champion dancer who had been preening by the stage, now watching her with a bemused, predatory smirk. She looked only at the lead violinist of the orchestra. From the beginning, "Please," she said, her voice calm but carrying the authority of an artist. And with feeling, con passion, the violinist, a man who had played for kings and presidents, was taken aback for a second. Then a slow smile of respect spread across his face. He nodded, raised his bow, and the first, haunting, unforgettable notes of Por una cabeza sliced through the air. Donovan Sterling leaned back, a smug, satisfied smile on his face, waiting for the inevitable stumble, the awkward shuffle, the confirmation of his cruel superiority. He crossed his arms, ready to enjoy the show, but the show was not the one he had produced. Elara did not move immediately. She stood still, her eyes closed, letting the music wash over her, letting it seep into her bones. And then she took her first step. It was not the hesitant, clumsy movement of an amateur. It was a gancho, a hook of the leg, executed with a slow, deliberate grace and a perfect, heartbreaking extension. It was a movement of pure, liquid tango, a single, opening line of a poem that spoke of love and loss. And Donovan Sterling froze. His smug smile evaporated, wiped clean from his face as if it had never been there. His arms uncrossed, his hands gripping the edge of his chair, the breath caught in his throat. It was more than just a dance step. It was a memory, a ghost. It was the exact way Isabella used to begin the dance, a signature move of hers, a gesture so intimate, so uniquely her, that seeing it recreated here by this stranger was like watching a portrait suddenly come to life. He was no longer a spectator at a cruel game. He was a man pierced to the core by a shard of his own forgotten past. The seed of doubt not about the dance, but about everything he thought he knew was planted in that single, stunning moment of grace. Elara was no longer dancing in a Chicago ballroom. She was dancing in a memory. With her eyes half closed, she moved not against an opponent, but with a phantom partner, a ghost she channeled through the exquisite language of her body. The guests, who had been waiting for a comedy, were now the silent, captivated audience of a tragedy. Donovan Sterling's investigation was not one of facts and figures, but of the heart. Every step Elara took was a piece of evidence, a clue that dismantled his cynical worldview. He watched, transfixed, as she executed a flawless ocho cortado, a cut-8 figure, her feet gliding across the marble with a whisper-like precision. It was Isabella's favorite sequence, a complex, intimate move she had always said was like a conversation between two souls. And here, this stranger was speaking it fluently. He wasn't just watching a skilled dancer. He was watching the reincarnation of a feeling he thought was lost to him forever. Elara's dance was not a technical reproduction. It was an emotional interpretation. In her posture, he saw not just the pride of a tango dancer, but the specific, fierce pride Isabella held. In the sweep of her arm, he saw not just a flourish, but the exact, expressive gesture his wife used to make when she was lost in the music. The crowd felt it too. The initial shock had deepened into a hushed, reverent awe. The smirks had vanished, replaced by wide, unblinking eyes. The whispers had died, replaced by the collective, held breath of an audience witnessing something raw and profoundly real. The champion dancer, who had been preparing to step onto the floor to save her, now stood frozen by the stage, his own expertise rendered irrelevant. He was a technician. She was a poet. Donovan found himself leaning forward, his entire being focused on her, cataloguing every micro-expression. He saw the way her brow would furrow slightly in concentration before a difficult turn, just as Isabella's had. He saw the faint, almost imperceptible smile that touched her lips during the violin's soaring crescendo. A smile of pure, unadulterated joy in the music itself. He was seeing a ghost, but a ghost more vivid and alive than any memory he had allowed himself to access in 2 years. His cruel dare had been a desperate attempt to prove that Isabella's magic was gone, that her dance was nothing more than a series of steps anyone could be taught. But Elara, with every passionate, perfect movement, was proving the opposite. She was proving that the spirit of the dance, the duende, was real. And in doing so, she was forcing Donovan to confront the very beauty he had tried so hard to destroy. His heart, long dormant, was conducting its own painful, breathtaking investigation into the love he had tried to bury. The story of how Elara Vance knew this dance, knew its very soul, was written not in triumph, but in sacrifice. As she moved across the floor, her body was a vessel for a history the glittering crowd could never have imagined. Her tango was not a performance learned in the pristine, mirrored studios of the wealthy. It was a legacy, a lifeline, a language passed down in the cramped living room of a small apartment on the south side of Chicago. Her parents had been dancers, her father, a jazz musician who found his heart in the rhythms of Buenos Aires, her mother, the daughter of immigrants, who discovered the fierce, proud poetry of tango as a young woman. Their life had not been one of wealth, but it had been rich with music and movement. The tango was their love language, their nightly ritual, the inheritance they intended to pass on to their daughter. Elara had been a prodigy. By 16, she was winning regional competitions, her name a whisper of future greatness in the competitive dance world. She and her partner were a blur of passion and precision, destined for the national stage. Her parents poured every spare dollar, every ounce of their belief into her dream. The dance was to be her ticket out, her flight into a bigger world. Then came the fire. It was a cold Tuesday in November, an electrical fault in their aging apartment building. It took everything: her parents, their home, her costumes, her trophies, her future, she and her younger brother, Leo, then just 14, survived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a grief so vast it threatened to swallow them whole. The world of dance, with its demanding schedules and expensive lessons, became an impossible luxury. Elara, at 19, became the sole provider, the guardian, the bedrock. She packed away her worn Tango shoes, the soft leather still holding the shape of her feet, and entered a different world. A world of double shifts, of aching arches from standing for 12 hours, of the quiet, gnawing exhaustion of survival. She took jobs where she could be anonymous, where no one would ask about the dreams she had left behind. Serving at galas like this one was a particularly cruel irony. She was a guest in a world she was no longer allowed to enter, surrounded by the very art form she had been forced to abandon. But she had never truly left the dance. The music lived in her memory, in the muscle and sinew of her body, in the quiet moments, waiting for the bus late at night. She would trace the steps of a bandoneon melody on the cracked pavement. She taught Leo the basic steps in their tiny kitchen, their laughter a small, defiant act of joy against the encroaching darkness. The tango was no longer a path to glory. It was a secret act of remembrance, a way to keep the spirit of her parents alive. And Por una cabeanza, the song that now filled the ballroom, had been their song, the one her father would hum as he held her mother, the one that represented everything she had loved and lost. For Donovan Sterling, the dance floor had become a courtroom, and he was the one on trial. The evidence being presented was his own memory, a torrent of images and feelings he had spent 2 years violently suppressing. He watched Elara, but he saw Isabella, and in seeing her, he was forced to confront the full, devastating truth of what he had lost. His cruel challenge was, at its core, a trap he had set for himself. In his grief-stricken mind, Por una cabeza had become a cursed object. It was the song that had defined his happiness, and therefore it was the source of his current agony. He couldn't bear to hear it, yet he couldn't escape it. It was the last song he and Isabella had danced to, just a week before she collapsed, in this very ballroom, at this very gala. He had believed, in his arrogant despair, that by forcing a clumsy, untrained waitress to stumble through its intricate rhythms, he could break its power. He wanted to shatter the memory, to prove that it was just a song, that the magic was not in the melody, but in the woman who was now gone. He wanted to make it ugly so it would stop hurting him. It was an act of profound self-mutilation, an attempt to cauterize a wound with a branding iron. But the trap had backfired spectacularly. Elara was not desecrating the memory. She was resurrecting it. She danced with a spirit so uncannily similar to Isabella's that it was as if his wife's ghost had slipped into this stranger's body to deliver a message. Elara's performance was not a pale imitation. It was a vibrant, living embodiment of everything he had been trying to forget. The forgotten truth, the one he had locked away in the deepest vault of his heart, was now on full public display. The truth was that his love for Isabella was the one truly authentic thing in his life. The truth was that his cold, cynical persona was a brittle facade, a lie he told himself to survive the day. The truth was that he was not a king in a castle, but a prisoner in a cage of his own making. He had dared Elara to dance to prove that the beauty was gone. But as she moved across the floor, a vision of grace and passion, she was proving the opposite. She was proving that beauty endures. She was proving that the spirit of the tango, the spirit of Isabella, was not something that could be owned or destroyed. It was a force of nature, and it had just been unleashed in the middle of his carefully controlled world. The trap had not caught her, it had caught him, forcing him to face the very emotions he had tried so desperately to kill. As Elara transitioned into the tango's fiery, passionate crescendo, the memories that had been lapping at the shores of Donovan's consciousness became a tidal wave, crashing over the sea walls he had so carefully constructed. He was no longer in the ballroom. He was in a whirlwind of moments, each one as vivid and painful as the last. He saw Isabella, her dark hair flying as she spun in his arms on their wedding day, her laughter echoing in a sun-drenched courtyard in Seville. He saw her teaching him the basic steps in their living room, her patience endless as he, a man of rigid, calculated movements, struggled to find the rhythm she seemed to breathe. "Don't think, Donovan," she would whisper, her hand warm on his back. "Just feel. The tango is not in your feet, it's in your soul." The counterattack was not coming from an external enemy. It was coming from within. Every note of the violin was a memory. Every pulse of the bass was a heartbeat he remembered against his own. He saw her in the small, dusty dance halls of Buenos Aires, where she had dragged him on a business trip, insisting he experience the real tango. He had been impatient, eager to get back to his meetings, but she had pulled him onto the floor, and, for a few stolen hours, he had forgotten about stock prices and quarterly reports, lost in the intoxicating world she carried within her. And then came the most brutal memory of all, the one he had fought the hardest to bury. It was from this same gala, 2 years prior. Isabella had been feeling weak for weeks, but she had insisted on attending, on dancing. He had held her in his arms, feeling the subtle, almost imperceptible fragility in her frame. He had spun her, and for a moment she was her old self, all fire and passion. But as the final note of Por una cabeza hung in the air, he had felt her lean against him, a dead weight, her breath coming in shallow gasps. It was the last time they ever danced. Now, watching Elara execute a flawless, impossibly passionate volio, her leg kicking out in a sharp, beautiful arc, Donovan could no longer contain it. The dam of his carefully constructed composure broke. A single hot tear escaped and tracked a path down his stone-like face. It was a betrayal of everything he had become, a public declaration of the grief he had denied for so long. The crowd, caught in the spell of Elara's dance, did not notice at first, but a few people sitting near him did. A woman gasped softly. A man looked away, embarrassed to witness such a raw, private moment. Donovan didn't care. He was no longer performing. He was no longer the arrogant billionaire. He was just a man, stripped bare in a room full of strangers, watching the ghost of his greatest love and his greatest loss dance before his very eyes. The memory had launched its counterattack, and his defenses had been obliterated. As Donovan's carefully constructed world dissolved into a blur of tears and memory, an unexpected and powerful ally emerged on the dance floor. It wasn't a person, but a presence. It was the music itself. The members of the string quartet were not just hired musicians playing a set list. They were artists, and they recognized the raw, electrifying magic that was unfolding before them. They had started the song as a professional obligation, a response to a rich man's whim. But as they watched Elara dance, as they felt the seismic shift in the room's emotional landscape, their performance transformed. The lead violinist, a seasoned maestro who had played in the world's greatest concert halls, was the first to change. He closed his eyes, his playing becoming less a recitation and more a conversation. He began to follow Elara's movements, his bow weeping with a new, profound sorrow during her slower, more introspective steps, then soaring with a fiery passion that matched her sharp, staccato footwork. He wasn't just playing the notes, he was narrating her story. The cellist, sensing the shift, deepened his tone, his instrument becoming the sorrowful, resonant heartbeat of the dance. The pianist, a young prodigy from Juilliard, began to add subtle, improvisational flourishes, his chords echoing the tension and release in Elara's body. The music became a living, breathing entity in the room. It was no longer just a backdrop for the drama. It was an active participant. It became Elara's partner, supporting her, lifting her, amplifying the story she was telling. It wrapped itself around Donovan's grief, not to suffocate it, but to give it a voice, a form, a language more profound than words. The music became a bridge, connecting the silent, grieving man with the silent, dancing woman. It allowed them to share a space of profound, unspoken understanding. The guests in the room were no longer just watching a performance. They were immersed in an experience. The music was a current, pulling them all into the same river of emotion. For Elara, the music was a homecoming. It was the voice of her parents, the echo of her own lost dreams. She danced not just to the notes, but with them, a partnership of perfect, intuitive synergy. She was no longer a waitress in a borrowed moment. She was an artist, in her element, speaking her native tongue. And for Donovan, the music was a torment and a solace. Each note was a memory, a reminder of what he had lost. But it was also a validation, a confirmation that the beauty he remembered was real, that the love he felt was not a figment of his imagination. The music, in its heartbreaking beauty, was his unexpected ally, forcing him to confront the truth, but also holding him in a space of profound, cathartic grace. It was the very thing he had tried to weaponize, and it had. Instead, become the instrument of his emotional surrender. The final notes of Por una cabeza hung in the air, a single, sustained violin chord that seemed to hold the entire collective breath of the ballroom. Elara concluded not with a flashy, triumphant pose, but with a quiet, devastating stillness. She stood with her back to the audience, her shoulders rising and falling with her controlled, deep breaths, her head slightly bowed as if in prayer or mourning. For a beat, the room was suspended in a state of absolute, reverent silence. The spell was so complete that no one dared to break it. Then, a single drop of moisture, a bead of sweat, or perhaps a tear, traced a path from her temple down her cheek, catching the chandelier light like a solitary diamond before falling to the polished marble floor. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible detail, but in the charged stillness, it was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. It was the proof that what they had witnessed was not a performance. It was a confession. It was the physical manifestation of the heart and soul she had poured onto the dance floor. And then the room erupted. The applause was not the polite, rhythmic clapping of a society gala. It was a roar, a thunderous, spontaneous explosion of emotion. Guests were on their feet, their faces a mixture of awe and admiration. Shouts of brava cut through the din. The cold, cynical veneer of the city's elite had been shattered, replaced by a raw, genuine, and overwhelming appreciation for the art and the artist they had just witnessed. But Donovan Sterling did not clap. He sat frozen in his chair, the sound of the applause a distant, muffled roar. His entire focus was on the solitary, still figure of Elara. He saw the tear fall, and in that tiny, glistening drop, he saw the entirety of his own grief reflected back at him. He saw the pain he had refused to acknowledge, the tears he had refused to shed. Her tear was the final piece of evidence that convicted him in the court of his own conscience. It proved that this stranger, this waitress he had tried to humiliate, understood the soul of that song and therefore the soul of his loss more deeply than anyone. Her pain, so beautifully and honestly expressed, had given him permission to finally, truly feel his own. He didn't need to hear her life story. He didn't need a document or a confession. Her dance, and that single final tear, was the undeniable truth. It was the smoking gun that proved the bankruptcy of his own cynicism. It was the final, irrefutable evidence that love and beauty and grief were real, powerful forces that could not be mocked or controlled, but could only, in the end, be surrendered to. The applause continued to swell, but for Donovan, the trial was over, and the verdict was in. As the wave of applause finally began to recede, Donovan Sterling rose from his chair. He moved with a slow, heavy deliberation. The arrogant swagger of the billionaire replaced by the somber gravity of a man walking to his own sentencing. He didn't signal for the microphone to be brought to him. Instead, he walked onto the stage, the guests parting before him like a sea, and took the microphone from the stand himself. The room fell silent once more, a new, expectant hush settling over the crowd. They had witnessed the spectacle. Now they awaited the verdict from the man who had started it all. Donovan did not look at the audience. He looked only at Elara, who had finally turned to face him. her expression composed but weary, her eyes holding his with an unnerving, quiet clarity. "Tonight," he began, his voice raspy, a stranger to his own ears. "I asked for a moment of entertainment." He paused, swallowing hard. "Instead, I was given a moment of truth." He turned slightly, addressing the crowd, but his words were still a confession meant for Elara. "I have spent the last 2 years living in a world without music. I believed that the joy, the passion, the soul that my late wife, Isabella, brought to our lives had vanished with her. Tonight, I tried to prove that. I tried to take the song that was most sacred to us and break it." His voice cracked, a raw, audible fissure in his carefully constructed facade. "I wanted to show that without her, it was just notes on a page. I wanted to prove that her magic was gone forever." He looked back at Elara, his eyes now glistening with unshed tears. "And this woman, this artist, proved that I was a fool." He took a step closer to her, the microphone held loosely in his hand. "You did not just dance a tango, Ms. Vance. You resurrected a memory. You showed a room full of people and a man too blind to see that a spirit like my wife's, that a spirit like yours never truly dies. It simply waits for someone brave enough to give it a voice again." He then did something that shocked the room more than any cruel dare. He bowed. It was not a theatrical, showman's bow, but a deep, formal, and profoundly humble gesture of respect. A king bowing to the quiet, unassuming power that had just dethroned him. "I am not here to offer you a prize," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its old command, but now infused with a new, sincere purpose. "A prize would be an insult to what you have given us. I am here to publicly apologize for my arrogance, for my cruelty, and for my own pathetic, cowardly grief." The curtain on his old life had not just fallen, he had torn it down himself, in front of the entire world, confessing his sins and, in doing so, taking the first terrifying step toward his own redemption. Donovan's public confession was an act of self-immolation. It incinerated the carefully crafted persona of the cold, untouchable billionaire, leaving in its place something raw, human, and painfully vulnerable. The justice that followed was not legal, but restorative, a realignment of dignity and purpose in the wake of his emotional collapse. He did not wait for the applause to die down. Still holding the microphone, he turned to face the hushed, stunned audience. "A promise was made tonight," he said, his voice gaining strength, imbued with a new, clear-eyed resolve. "A scholarship for the brother of this incredible woman, but that is no longer sufficient. It is a pittance in the face of what we have witnessed." He looked toward his foundation's director, who was watching from the sidelines with a look of utter astonishment. "Tomorrow morning," Donovan announced, "we will begin the process of establishing the Isabella Sterling Endowment for the Performing Arts. Its mission will be to provide full, comprehensive support, not just tuition, but housing, training, and travel expenses for gifted young artists from underserved communities who, like Ms. Vance, have had their dreams derailed by tragedy." A wave of astonished murmurs swept through the room. This was not a token gesture. It was a multi-million-dollar commitment, a seismic shift in his foundation's focus. And its first official beneficiary, Donovan continued, his eyes finding Elara's once more, will be her brother, Leo Vance. He will have his education, and he will want for nothing. He then turned to Elara. And Ms. Vance, he said, his voice softening, the endowment will also offer you a position, not as a beneficiary, but as a founding member of its advisory board. Your voice, your experience, your soul is precisely what we need to ensure this foundation does real, meaningful work. We need you to help us find the others who, like you, have been silenced. The justice being delivered was not about punishing him, but about empowering her. He was not just giving her a reward, he was handing her a platform, a set of tools to ensure that no other artist would have to suffer the same fate she had. He was transforming his own personal act of cruelty into a public act of restorative good. Elara stood, momentarily overwhelmed. The future she had given up on, the world of art and dance she had been forced to abandon, was suddenly being handed back to her, not just as a participant, but as a leader. The weight of his offer, the sheer, life-altering scale of it, was immense. The crowd, finally understanding the magnitude of what was happening, began to applaud again, this time not just for her dance, but for the profound, unexpected grace that was unfolding before them. The collapse of Donovan Sterling's cynical world had created a vacuum, and into that vacuum he was pouring the foundations of a new, more hopeful one. In the months that followed the gala, the story of Donovan Sterling and Elara Vance became a quiet legend in the philanthropic and arts communities of Chicago. It was a story told not with the breathless excitement of a scandal, but with the hushed reverence reserved for a genuine miracle. The Isabella Sterling Endowment was established with a speed and efficiency that only a billionaire's resources could command, but it was guided by a spirit that was entirely new. Elara, after much soul-searching, accepted the position on the advisory board. She did not, however, give up her independence. She refused a salary, choosing instead to accept a modest stipend that allowed her to quit her grueling service jobs and focus on what truly mattered. Her first act was not to review grant proposals, but to open a small, unassuming dance studio in the heart of her own neighborhood. The sign above the door, painted by her brother Leo, simply read, "Vance Dance." It wasn't a sleek, mirrored studio for the wealthy. It was a place with worn wooden floors and second-hand ballet bars, a place where the sound of laughter and scuffed shoes was more common than polite applause. It was a haven for the neighborhood kids, a place where they could learn the discipline and joy of dance, regardless of their ability to pay. Donovan Sterling became a different man. The cynical, sharp-edged tycoon was slowly replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful philanthropist. He threw himself into the work of the foundation, but he did so as a student, not a master. He deferred to Elara's judgment, listened to her insights, and for the first time in his life, learned the art of following. He became a silent, almost shy benefactor to her studio. Anonymous donations would arrive to cover the cost of new dance shoes. A new sound system would appear overnight. When the old building's heating failed in the dead of winter, a team of his best contractors was there the next morning to replace the entire system, free of charge. He never took credit. These were not transactions. They were quiet acts of penance and respect. Occasionally, He would visit. He would park his car a block away and walk to the studio, standing in the doorway, never entering, just watching. He would watch as Elara taught a group of giggling 7-year-olds the basic steps of a waltz. He would watch as Leo, now a confident freshman at the University of Chicago, helped his sister repair a broken tap shoe. He would watch the raw, untamed joy on the children's faces, and in those moments he found a measure of peace that his billions had never been able to buy. A new dawn had broken, not just for Elara and Donovan, but for the community they were building. The foundation was no longer just a memorial to Isabella. It was a living, breathing testament to her spirit, a force for the very kind of creative, compassionate good she had championed. The change was real, it was tangible, and it was growing, one dance step at a time. 1 year to the day after the fateful gala, the Vance Dance Studio held its first public recital. The small space was packed to the rafters with proud parents, neighborhood friends, and a few curious local reporters. The air was electric with the excited chatter of children and the smell of popcorn and fresh flowers. Elara stood in the wings, a quiet, calming presence, giving a final word of encouragement to a nervous young girl about to perform her first solo. Leo was managing the lights, his face a mask of happy, focused concentration. Donovan Sterling sat in the back row, an anonymous figure in a simple dark sweater. He had asked if he could attend, and Elara had simply replied, "Of course, your family." The word had struck him with a force he hadn't anticipated. The recital was a triumph of joy over circumstance. The children, some in homemade costumes, danced with a heart and passion that far outshone any technical imperfections. They were not polished professionals. They were children who had been given a space to be seen, and they were radiant. The final performance of the evening was a tango. As the first notes of Por una cabeza filled the small studio, a hush fell over the audience. A young couple, 2 of Elara's most dedicated students, took to the floor. They danced with a raw, youthful energy, their performance a beautiful, hopeful echo of the one that had changed everything. As the music swelled, Elara walked from the wings and stood beside Donovan in the back of the room. They watched the dance together, 2 silent figures bound by a shared, complex history. Isabella would have loved this, Donovan said, his voice thick with an emotion that was no longer grief, but a quiet, profound gratitude. He was not looking at the dancers, but at the faces in the audience, at the proud, teary-eyed mother of the young tango dancer, at the beaming father of a boy who had finally found his confidence. "Yes," Elara replied softly. "I think she would have." They were not a couple. Their story had not resolved itself into a simple fairy tale romance. It had become something far more real and more meaningful. They were partners in a legacy. They were 2 broken souls who, through an unlikely and painful collision, had helped each other to become whole again. The legacy they had built was not in the gleaming towers of downtown Chicago, but here, in this small, vibrant room filled with music and laughter. It was in Leo's future, in the confidence of the young dancers on the stage, in the quiet, enduring power of an art form to heal, to connect, and to redeem. As the final notes of the tango faded and the small studio erupted in thunderous, heartfelt applause, Donovan turned to Elara. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic gestures. He simply looked at her, his eyes clear and full of a respect that was deeper than any apology. "Thank you, Elara," he said. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. "You're welcome, Donovan." They were no longer the billionaire and the waitress. They were just two people, standing in the light, listening to the music.